back to A Pastor's View, sponsored by the Denison Forum. I'm Mark Turman, the pastor at Cross Point Church and host of A Pastor's View, and we're back with Dr. Jim Denison. Dr. Jim, thanks for spending some time with us today.
Yeah, so glad to be with you again today, Mark. Thanks.
Let's pick up the topic of COVID-19 again. And one of the interesting thoughts I had about where we are with this is how just 18 months ago, I was in Washington, D.C. for a conference. I heard a scholar from Oxford named John Lennox talk about how so many in our world for the last several decades had looked to science as the ultimate source and significant hope in their life. He even wrote a book called "Can Science Answer Everything?" or "Explain Everything?" And kind of the ironic thing that seems to be going on from my perspective is there is so much trust in science and scientific development right up until now, where we've developed hopefully a super effective vaccination for COVID-19. But now all the conversations of doubt and debate and even conflict are starting to arise about the reality of taking the vaccine or not taking the vaccine. What do you think about all of that from a theological perspective of it's kind of like, well, we all wanted science to be our God until we really needed it?
It's really true. It's an ironic question, quite frankly. John Lennox is marvelous. I'm a huge fan, and so glad you had that experience with him. And he writes, obviously, in his space out of a scientific background as well as an apologist. And he's exactly right. I mean, you and I have kind of grown up in a world where the scientific white coat kind of replaced the priest's robe, you know? Yeah. And if the doctor said it or the scientist said it, it must just somehow be true. You find a lot of people that will tell you science is kind of their God, or they follow the science, and kind of this sense as though there's some kind of mystical or almost divine capacity there. Well, that's obviously never been the case. And true scientists should tell you that. Science is a category. It's not a thing. It's like leaves. What color are leaves? How much do leaves weigh? Well, you mean that oak leaf or that pecan leaf, right? And so you're thinking medical science versus physics versus quantum physics versus chemical science, all these various versions of this and so many practices within it. But what I think we mean by that when we talk about kind of deifying science is the scientific method. The idea that we can, through objective, empirical, human reason alone, come to ultimate truth, which will solve our largest problems. That kind of sort of fallacious, idolatrous idea has certainly been in the currency for decades now. And you're right. What we're seeing now with this specific pandemic is kind of the lie in all of that. We're in a post-truth culture now. We're in a truth is what I say it is, postmodern, relativistic culture. And even if the doctors tell me I should do something, well, I'll do it if it seems right to me, if that's my truth. Something as simple as whether wearing a mask is a good idea or not, or taking a vaccine is a good idea or not, is filtered through personal individual truth now. We struggle with this in the healthcare system. Where I'm resident scholar for ethics. We'll have patients now that will look up a condition online and dispute their doctor's diagnosis based on some website that they've discovered, not even necessarily from medical professionals, or some Facebook post, or some friend that had an experience of a certain kind. So we're at a place now where science, like everything else, is being filtered through the lens of my truth toward what I want truth to be. We're back to Genesis 3, being our own God yet again.
Reminds me of what a family ministry writer named Tim Elmore talks about. He wrote a book called Artificial Maturity, where he describes many young people, but also people in general, where we have access to so much information now that doesn't come through historical filters like parents and pastors and teachers and coaches and people that have studied and been around long enough. But what happens is people access all of this information through technology, and just by having the information, they become arrogant, while at the same time, they're trembling inside because it hasn't become wisdom for them.
That's so true. I heard Henry Kissinger a couple of years ago, I guess, make that point in a way that really stuck with me, where he said we have more knowledge than ever before, but less wisdom. You know, his point was that in order for something to become wisdom, it first has to be internalized knowledge. Well, I don't need to memorize or master truth anymore, or knowledge, because it's on my phone.
Hmm.
I can access it and so quickly that I don't really need to learn history. I don't need to learn a great deal of the knowledge that you and I grew up with having to learn. And until you've internalized knowledge, it's hard to turn it into wisdom. And so we don't have the pathway to wisdom because we're in some ways absenting ourselves from the knowledge it takes to get there. Back in the early 90s, I think it was, Jane Jacobs wrote a book, Dark Age Coming. And that was her point. Not that we're going to be illiterate necessarily, but that we're not going to know what to read, and we're certainly not going to know how to evaluate what we read. I can illustrate that very quickly in the context of COVID-19. I was reading this morning about a theory that's out there that's being promoted on some social media that suggests that the vaccine is going to implant a chip in those that take it that will allow the government to follow them wherever they go. Mm-hmm. Well, the way that's gotten started is that one of the syringe makers has apparently offered an optional chip, which would be part of the labeling on the syringe, which would allow a pharmacy or a doctor to be able to track whether that vaccine is now outdated, whether it's been used, whether more needs to be ordered, that sort of thing. It's in no sense something that would be injected. It couldn't be injected. There is no ability to track you based on something like that. And so this optional chip on a label of a syringe got turned into kind of an urban myth that's now being promoted all across social media. And it looks pretty convincing when you go back and you watch the video with no larger background. It's an example of that fact. When I wrote my first book back many years ago, I was much younger than I am now. I had to go through 3 editors. Then from there, we had to get to the publisher. It took something like 9 months from the time I started the book until the book was a finished product, because there were so many checks and balances and accountabilities built into the system. Well, now, as you know, anybody can post like we are today, any video they want. They can say what they want to say, and there's just really no filter anymore. And that's a wonderful thing in terms of being able to get immediate access to content. It's really a bad thing relative to accountability.
Right, which is where the thing we talked about the last couple of conversations about having interpreters and going to reliable sources and learning how to do that is absolutely critical. I think it kind of memory makes me remember about Einstein, I think it was, who said, I don't need to write down, or I don't need to remember anything that is written down. I can go look it up. We've kind of warped that out. Yeah. And we think we don't really have to learn or do the research necessary to get to what is true and what is verifiable. If we can look it up on Google, we think that that's enough.
Based on the people we happen to trust. So we curate our news sources. We're only listening to certain filters and certain platforms, certain readers, certain speakers. Somebody says this is X, so we believe it's X, or this is Y, so we believe it's Y. It's really back, isn't it, to the Corinthian day where they were, it was milk versus meat. Paul said, I want to offer you meat, but I can't. I have to offer you milk. Well, milk is digested meat, as it were. The mother cow eats the food, as it were, and digests it and turns it into milk that the calf can take. So it's second order stuff. Well, that's where I'm afraid we are. We're not doing a lot of our own eating, a lot of our own chewing. We're getting our news curated and interpreted through people. And that's a pretty dangerous place to be.
Especially in a pandemic.
Yeah.
Especially in a pandemic,
so.
Where accurate information is absolutely critical for churches and communities to navigate well. I wanted to, before we finish up today, ask your opinion about one quick question. Pastors and churches have had more debate and conflict and angst over a little piece of cloth than just about anything else over the last 10 months.
Yeah.
And many pastors, there are many people who are documenting now that a lot of pastors are just fatigued, burned out, and bailing out, getting out. Mm-hmm. Talked to a friend in Houston that his pastor resigned just because he was worn out with everything that is going on. Speak a little bit to your thoughts about a pastor standing in conflict with his church about how they are navigating COVID-19. And is there ever a time where a pastor just needs to say that he would surrender his ministry rather than to follow a certain direction about how a church manages this pandemic?
That's a great question. I think there absolutely could be that place. I think there could be a place where a pastor becomes convinced, based on his specific data, his specific context, his specific situation, for instance, that having in-person worship is dangerous. Now, I'm not saying that's the case for a Spisadian particular church, but there's certainly some for which that could be the case, where he just doesn't believe his members are going to wear masks, they're not going to distance, they're not going to practice hygiene, they're going to be elderly members there, at-risk members there, they don't have good ventilation. He knows that preaching or singing projects the virus 28 feet. So he knows that it's more dangerous to be in a worship service than a lot of other group environments, that sort of thing. And he just becomes convinced that he's putting his members at risk. And he has leaders in the church who absolutely refuse to follow his leadership. And if he follows their leadership, people could die as a result. I suppose if you got to that kind of extreme situation, you'd have a place where you'd really have to wonder what the right moral thing is to do here. On the other hand, if he resigns, is that going to keep the church from having its in-person worship services that he's so concerned about? Really, the right thing, I think, to do is to try to keep from being there. One of the ways that, I'll say this quickly because I know we're short on time, one of the things that does concern me that I've seen for the last number of years in church governance, as churches have moved away from congregational governance, it's become a place where more and more you're seeing churches being led by individuals without much accountability through a process of leadership. And that can be really, really dangerous. What I think you want is a world where you have some people who are really trusted by the members of the church, who have a great deal of cultural credibility inside the church, who can come together around this, who can pray and think and work through this and come to collective decisions so that you avoid this kind of a us versus them, zero-sum conflict where really at the end of the day, somebody's right and somebody's wrong. If you get to that place, there were some dynamics prior to getting there that I would think perhaps could have been healthier. But it's easy for me to say that because I don't have that circumstance. What I do right now in my specific locale, back when I was pastoring churches, though, I could absolutely see a day when, whether it was this or something else, a pastor cannot move forward with a church based on what he considers to be immoral, unethical, or unbiblical leadership. I would hope not to be at that case, but I could see how it could happen.
Right. And as in church life always, right, things move at the speed of relationships, and so relationships matter. What I've tried to encourage my leaders here at Crosspoint, we haven't always agreed on how we were going to manage this journey, but I've tried to encourage all of us to hold our views lightly,
right? Because
it's likely going to take us a number of months, certainly even years, before we really understand how much of this we got right and how much of it we got wrong. And so any position that we take, we should hold it with humility and with a willingness to change as more information becomes available.
To accommodate as best we can, to find consensus wherever possible, to all be in this together. Right. Our enemy is not each other, our enemy is the virus.
Right.
And we want to do everything we can to advance the kingdom of God to the glory of God in the midst of such a challenging day. I would add this very quickly. Pastors in a day like this really become pastors at the time of crisis, at a time of conflict, at a time of need, as in no other context. They call us as preachers, but they decide if we get to be pastors. And ministering to people at difficult times is how we do that and how we build the credibility for ministry for perhaps years to come.
Yes, I totally agree. Thank you for taking some time with us today. I hope this is helpful to our audience, and we look forward to future conversations. God bless you, everybody.